there's so much kind of conversation in the media around what's happening with boys and men, but I think so much of it remains kind of vague, and it also there's a limited inclusion of looking at what's happening in Christianity. I think because people think maybe that's niche, or maybe, young people are not as religious as they used to be, which is certainly true. But what I keep saying is that there is an American cultural conception of God that is
Yeah,
overtly masculine.
yeah.
That cultural conception, regardless of the religiosity of young boys and men.
So I'm going to introduce you properly here. We are going live and doing our thing, and let everybody know that I just getting over a cold. So if I have to mute and cough and you see that, don't be weirded out. Um, I'm talking to a friend of the show, if you want to put it that way, Angela, who's been on with us before, and Angela Denker in conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest is Reverend Angela Denker. Angela is an ELCA Lutheran pastor, veteran journalist, and columnist for the Minnesota Star Tribune. We've spoken before together about her book, Red State Christians, A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind. And I'll ask you how that book's done in a moment. We're here today to discuss her new book that comes out 4 days from now, I think. Today's her March 25th, Disciples of White Jesus and the Radicalization of American Boyhood. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm Frank Schaeffer, and please subscribe right now on YouTube and In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Okay, so I read the book in a file that Ernie, my producer, sent me because it's not out yet, although I did the right thing. I want you to know that I bought it on Kindle. So not only are we doing a podcast, I am a paying customer. And I always like to say that because, you want your books to sell. So I bought a pre-copy, and I guess it'll go live on my Amazon Kindle, whatever, where I bought it at midnight on a couple of days from now. But I already read it. And
Yes.
so let me dive right in and first of all say you have a weird way of writing books that then become sort of fulfilled prophecies, because you must have been working on this book before the second Trump election. Obviously, you didn't write it and publish it in 2 months. When did you start writing the book? When did this become a project with you, sort of date wise? When did you do this?
Yeah, my first research travel was in fall of 2023.
Yeah,
Um, So it was about 6 months writing process, but really the lead up to the book, was longer than that. Of course, with some of the preliminary research and definitely book study of other books, and really,
yeah,
I think, as you mentioned, Red State Christians, and I mean, looking at my two book titles, from Red State Christians to Disciples of White Jesus,
yeah,
it really shows the transition in the growth of Christian nationalism and sort of
yeah,
the growth of Trumpism in America. We've really made a shift. So
yeah.
I don't like to be so prescient, but here we are.
Yeah. So before you write another book and ruin my life by getting Donald Trump elected again, or somebody like him, please write to me and say, should I be writing about, how old artist writers all got rounded up and marched off and killed or something? I'll say, no, please don't, because I'm one of those people. And
Exactly.
I don't want you. You're too prescient.
I
Let me
feel
dive into the book, which I enjoyed, and we're going to make it a book club offering. And Ernie will text me when this will be, but it'll be in our Has to Be Read series.
thank you.
Let me first of all just sort of go through the list of chapters for people. There's the introduction, the violence of white Christian masculinity, white Christian men, archetype and reality, created in God's image, question mark, WWJB, who would Jesus be, oppressors and victims, schoolboys, the fear and love of God. So that to fear and love God, confirming white boys in the faith, innocuous white supremacists, Midwestern small towns, etc., Wild West, wild men, and de-radicalization conclusion. So I'm going to start by pulling some quotes out. Forgive me because I haven't done the quotes in order. I've sort of done them in the way that I want to introduce the book. And the first thing I just want to say is something I think I pulled out at the end of the book. As I dive deeper and deeper into research about young white Christian men in America, it quickly became clear to me that two statements dominate discussion of men and boys today. Men and boys are the problem, men and boys are in trouble. I see these two overlapping truths about men and boys as central to understanding the role of radicalization in their lives. And then at another point in the book, you talk about Christine Emba, um, wrote a lengthy essay, someone I follow and read her stuff, about the challenges facing men and the dearth of mainstream responses about what a quote, healthy masculinity might look like. She rightly points out the tendency to think that attention to men and boys might limit resources for continued needed focus on women and girls, a point also made by author and researcher Richard V. Reeves in his 2022 book-length study on masculinity, boys and men. So that sort of sets up the book in a way. And then you write near the beginning of the book, of course, I could write about boyhood without thinking about my own sons. While I wrote about and researched boys and young men, I was living through the golden moment in time with my sons while they were looking and acting more like young men on the cusp of becoming teenagers. And so that kind of locates the book for your reader in your own life. So that's the kind of setup. And I'd just like you to comment on the structure and the scope of the book, and then I'd like to go to some specific passages.
Yeah, thank you for raising all that and sharing those quotes from Emba. That is, there's so much kind of conversation in the media around what's happening with boys and men, but I think so much of it remains kind of vague, and it also there's a limited inclusion of looking at what's happening in Christianity. I think because people think maybe that's niche or maybe, young people are not as religious as they used to be, which is certainly true. But what I keep saying is that there is an American cultural conception of God that is
Yeah,
overtly masculine.
yeah,
That cultural conception, regardless of the religiosity of young boys and men, continues to shape behavior and identity.
yeah,
So I bring three lenses to every work I do, but certainly to both of these books and to this book. And you see me kind of shifting through those different lenses as I
yeah,
write the book and the different chapters. So the first one is that of a pastor and of a theologian, somebody who's been trained in biblical study and also who has a lot of experience working in congregations
yeah,
with young men and boys.
yeah,
So there's that perspective. There's the perspective of a journalist and a researcher,
yeah,
you know, and I mean journalist in the best sense of the word, in which
sure.
I entered into this work open to where the research would lead.
Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
I did not have a hard thesis going into it. And I think sometimes when I talk to academics about my research, it's very different for them. They approach it with a solid thesis and then looking to, in many cases, kind of understand that thesis through the research.
Yeah,
So the work that I do as a journalist is really qualitative and looking for narratives, looking for stories. And then, as you mentioned, that final lens really is a personal one.
yeah,
In Red State Christians, it was looking at my own family members and loved ones who had been a part of the mega movement, had been
sure.
impacted by it as Christians. For this book, it's really as a mom and the conversations that I have with other moms of boys near to me, far from me,
Yeah,
on the basketball court, at the park, at school pickup and drop off. And that personal lens is really important because I think it guards against what sometimes happens when we're studying groups of people is
sure.
this dehumanization or this sense that they're only a subject and not, not a full human being that we need to understand and love as well.
Yeah, and one of the things you do in your book that you actually write about at the conclusion, interestingly enough, when you're saying, well, after reading a book like this, you're going to be waiting for answers. What are my 10 points, my solutions? How are we going to solve this? And you actually say something very interesting and kind of more original than that. You say, look, I've told my story by telling other people's stories. I'm not going to offer you an easy 5-point conclusion on how to solve this. The truth of how to solve it is in understanding that these were all individuals. And then you kind of list that. And I just want to go to that passage for a second, if I can find it without going around too much. And you talk about, you name the people, and I think there's what, about more than a dozen stories, aren't there, specific that you actually flesh out? I don't have all the names right in front of me, but how many people's stories did you tell within the context of the entire book, where you delve fairly deeply into their stories? And then, of course, the other thing you do is you talk about people like Driscoll and others who have been leaders in a movement that's really led the evangelical movement towards this sort of hard idea of, who Jesus was, what men should be, kind of the Andrew Tate wing of evangelicalism. So, there's a lot there. But let's first talk about some of these stories you tell and the kind of way you got into that, and a writer's choice to make your point by telling stories, which I find very fetching, and actually more convincing than just sort of laying out your point. So I think you did very well at that. But just give me a thumbnail of the types of stories you tell, because I'm going to tend in my quotes to not go to the stories, but to go to more your conclusions and the main figures, because there's no way to retell a story unless I just sit here and read it to you, and we don't have the time to do that. So before we get into the kind of points I'm going to make and ask you about, tell me about the stories. Tell me about traveling around and talking to all these people. Tell me some of your experiences in writing the book and the kind of people you met.
Yeah. Um, and again, as I did in Red State Christians, I really want to make a distinction between people who mentioned, like Mark Driscoll, like Pastor Doug Wilson out in Idaho, like Jordan Peterson, like Andrew Tate, like Josh Hawley in Missouri, all of these sort of leading figures of the movement. Uh, those are the folks that I really want to hold accountable and that I
Yeah.
want to look at and also view them through the lens of the grift. That these are folks that have made a lot of money
Yes.
off of radicalizing
Yeah.
young boys and men. And they're really motivated by money.
Yeah.
So I want to make the distinction between them and really looking at the ways in which they need to be held accountable and the ways in which I don't see them necessarily as true ideological believers in a lot of senses, but rather as grifters and people who want to take advantage of others.
Yeah. Well, and they follow this white Jesus who you describe as white Jesus is on a violent quest for naked power and influence and wealth. White Jesus deals in absolutes, and those who are among the quote chosen are absolutely convinced of their own sanctification and worthiness. So you make the point that this theological construct of the white Jesus, as opposed to the historical Jesus, is one that they've built to justify some of this grift. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's probably true.
Yeah, and I think what I see, if I put on my journalist lens, what I see a lot of times in media that really bothers me is they'll conflate those two groups.
Yeah.
So they'll end up sort of demonizing and mocking sort of the everyday people who've been swindled and who've
Yeah.
become followers of the movement, while failing to really follow the money and hold accountable those who are making the most money, those who,
Hmm.
come out of the same spaces as much of the political elite in this country. So,
Yeah.
but let's get to the stories. The two overarching stories that frame the book, both in the beginning and the end, they're almost reversals of each other.
Mm.
They're stories that start in very similar places, but end up in very different places. One of the stories brings fear, concern, horror,
Mm.
and the other story brings a sense of hope of
Yeah.
a different way that masculinity can look, even when it originates in a similar place.
Yeah.
So the first story of the book is of Dylan Roof, who was a white supremacist
Right.
mass from South Carolina, who in one of the most horrific mass shootings of recent American history went
Yeah.
from his home to not to the capital, but to Charleston, South Carolina,
Yeah.
went to Mother Emanuel, one of the most historic, important churches in Black church history, sat in a Bible study with members and pastors of this church, and after an hour of Bible study, killed 9 people
Yeah.
at Mother Emanuel Church. So the reason that I started with the story of Dylan Roof is, first of all, that when we look at mass shootings and we look at sort of the problem and the danger that exists from young white men and boys, we see that most mass shooters do fit this profile. So it was
Yeah.
important to not look away from this danger. And for me also, people may assume, okay, we look at the story of Roof. He's radicalized online. He's from South Carolina. You start to make some assumptions about what his origins were like religiously.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
you may start to assume, well, of course, he comes from evangelicalism. He comes from a mega church conservative type environment.
Yeah.
The reality is that Dylan Roof came from an ELCA Lutheran congregation, the same denomination in which I'm ordained and that I grew up in.
Mm.
And it's not a particularly conservative denomination. It's a mainline historical denomination with some progressive stances
Mm.
socially. So it was important for me to begin with this story to break down this idea that we can assume, well, these bad parts of masculinity only happen somewhere else.
Right. It's somebody
Sometimes,
else's problem. And in fact, just to talk about that, because you have a little passage here that actually addresses that, and then I'm going to let you go back to the story.
yeah, thank you.
Racism and violence persist in America often because white Americans convince ourselves we have a certain distance from such ugliness, which is just what you're talking about. We talk about slavery and racial violence and even segregation and civil rights movement as though they were part of a forgotten distant past. We speak of purveyors of racist hatred and violence as if they were of another species. So that's sort of what you're saying here, isn't it?
Yes, and I see this over and over again as someone who's been in both conservative evangelical spaces and also mainline, more progressive spaces. I see it
Yeah,
over and over, and it does perpetuate these same behaviors and attitudes to persist.
yeah,
Uh, So I did. I went and paid my respects in Charleston and then drove a couple of hours to Columbia to the church where Dylan Roof grew up. I happened to be there on All Saints weekend, and one
yeah,
of those who the church was honoring that day was his father, who had recently died. And I spent a couple of really intense hours speaking with the pastor of that congregation,
yeah,
getting the sense of shame and guilt and
yeah,
regret that he felt, this sense of powerlessness that
yeah,
had come out of his congregation. And what was also really important to lift up too was his own grief. That
yeah,
not only had he been a pastor to this family,
yeah,
but he had also known the pastor of Mother Emanuel, Clement Pinckney, who was also a state representative in South Carolina, who spent
yeah,
a bit of time in Columbia as well. Uh, he had known Clement Pinckney as well, that they had made ashes together for Ash Wednesday.
yeah,
And so you begin the book with this sense of interconnectedness
yeah,
that there's no way to solve this problem of racism, of white supremacy, or of radicalization of young white men and boys without realizing how interconnected and interwoven all of it is.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so that's the first story. And then the story that sort of reverses it at the end of the book is the story of Pastor Caleb Campbell.
yeah.
Uh, Now, like Dylan Roof, Caleb Campbell he grew up in Texas and Arizona primarily. He grew up
Mm.
in conservative Christian household, and became sort of cynical about the church, about religion. And so he ended up getting involved with, in Phoenix, a white supremacist skinhead group,
Hmm.
and was living with them for a time, was engaging in violence and beatings. Uh, Ended up stepping out of that group. And I think this is important. If we look at the differences between Caleb Campbell and Dylan Roof was radicalized primarily online. Caleb being just that much older, there wasn't
Yes,
the scope of online radicalization.
yeah,
The almighty algorithm that we contend with now was not as powerful. And so Caleb was radicalized in person. And what
mm.
happens when you're radicalized in person, he began to see the fruits of that radicalization and realized that these people who he was looking up to in the group were
Yes,
not people that he wanted to end up being like. They were going to
sure.
jail. They were living in really shoddy living conditions. They were basically kind of losers.
Yeah, they were, and not hiding behind what they could project on a camera through a phone.
Absolutely. Now,
Yeah,
what's interesting about Caleb is that as he makes this reverse journey, he goes from being a skinhead to becoming sort of a disciple of Mark Driscoll.
yeah, who we'll get to in a minute because I've got some stuff I want to read about that.
Yes, and so we'll get to that. But Driscoll, if you're not aware who he is, you probably are if you're watching this, but kind of one of the leading purveyors of
Sure.
masculine Jesus, highly gendered view of church,
Yeah,
highly violent view of Jesus. And Caleb went and trained with Driscoll at Mars Hill, ends up becoming an evangelical pastor himself, ends up leading a church in Arizona to take us all the way up to the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
Uh, And Caleb is starting to feel some regret and some resistance of his following of Driscoll. He's starting to see the ways in which Driscoll's hunger for power and control
Mm.
has led him away from the gospel. But what really happens in COVID is that Caleb sees the ways his fellow people in this movement really prioritize their money, their power, their
Sure.
influence over keeping people safe during COVID. And so
Yeah.
as Caleb is trying to sort of take precautions and move worship online during COVID. He's got
Mm.
protests outside his church. He is suffering so much backlash, anger, resentment, harassment that he develops some really serious physical consequences,
Yeah.
which leads him to totally shift
Mm.
and become what he would call today a missionary to Christian nationalists
Yeah. Yeah.
and really use his platform, use his ministry as a resistance to what he calls the Leviathan of Christian nationalism and
Yeah.
of the many things that he had once been in favor of.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful story of a possible masculinity
And how somebody
that
comes out.
looks really different.
Let me
Yes.
bring up something that you mentioned in the book, and I'll have you explain it. This concept of the box, which
Mm.
sort of explains some of where these folks are coming from. We box in men, and anything that comes out of that box, we tell them is wrong. They've got to be tough, and they've got to be mean, and they've got to have muscles. It's this whole paradigm of what it means to be a man in a box. And then this goes on. My mom was very instrumental in how to be a man outside of that box. Curry said, "Now I want you to tell me about Curry, but mainly what I want to do is use that quote." And you're talking about, I thought about all the boys, parents, teachers, pastors who had told me about the teenage boys they knew who found themselves outside of the box. So before we move on, I just, let's talk about the box. Let's see what you're talking about here because it's something we should dive into.
Yeah, that is such a great framing quote and metaphor. And as you mentioned, comes from Bishop Yehiel Curry's bishop of the Chicago Synod in of the ELCA,
Yeah,
and pastor friend of mine who also married my brother and his wife. Leads a predominantly Black church and grew up in a much more Black context than many of the other young white men and boys who I study in the
yeah,
book.
yeah.
Uh, And what's important, I think, too, is that he gives us a glimpse not only outside this box of violent masculinity, but also outside this box of sort of white American Christian male
Right,
identity,
right.
that is very racialized and that is really connected to the racial power and hierarchy alongside the gender power and hierarchy, that upon which so much of this ideology stands. And we see really powerfully in this new Trump administration as well.
Yeah, that's happening right now in front of us. And that quote jumped out because, of course, it's another one of these ripped from the headlines Trump moment quotes. Let me just mention on the way through that Disciples of White Jesus will be our It Has to Be Read May offering of this year. So we're not too far behind your release date. We'll make it a book club. We will re-promote and talk to you about how to do that together and share various things we're doing. But we'll re-promote the book to our book club. It has to be read as a very, 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 very important and timely book for two reasons. One is the political thing, which is, of course, the way the title comes across, but because of the fact you've told people stories, if I can put it this way, you're a writer, but you're also the mother of sons. And so your level of concern and compassion for boys is not abstract. You're writing about people you love, even ones you very much disagree with, and in sometimes pity for their views. So the tone of the book is not judgmental and political. It's rather one of compassion and pastoral care of people who have been really misled, amongst other things, about their theological view or historical view of who Jesus was. Um, Let me just show the scope of the book by jumping into another thing. You talk about the Citadel, which is a military academy. The Citadel is not a Christian institution, but the tradition of white masculine identity it long upheld owes much to white conservative American Christianity, particularly as it is preached in the South. So just talk a little bit about that example, because you talk about rural schools, cities, countryside. And then, of course, this institutionalized idea of masculinity is one that, in this military academy, you go into some of the detail about how it's expressed there and how it's kind of gone off the rails. So would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, I think what was really evident to me when I was at the Citadel is just how much of this is a veneer, how much of it is a veil to cover up a, a darker and more difficult reality
Yeah,
than people want you to see. And also, it also connects to, for me, the ways in which we see this certainly in Trump and in Musk and in
yeah,
other sort of acolytes of the Disciples of White Jesus crowd, how much of this commitment to a violent, hierarchical, powerful masculinity is a cover up for a
yeah,
deeply seated male insecurity. Uh,
yeah,
and how much of it really isn't real, but it's a posture in order to cover up authentic identity. And so one fact that really stood out for me when I was at the Citadel, it was this beautiful fall afternoon, and I'm sitting here talking to a cadet and hearing about his experience, and he looks the part,
mm,
he's blonde, he's tall, he's muscular, he looks like, he could be on the cover of a brochure for the Citadel
sure.
from South Carolina, has family and loved ones who've gone to the Citadel in the past. And yet when you sort of begin to break down that veneer, he tells me about a friend from high school who had recently been found dead of an opioid, most likely overdose. And just what it was like for him to experience that grief.
Yeah,
Again, going back to this metaphor of the box, how does grief and compassion and love for a friend fit
yeah,
into a box where you're supposed to be stoic and not show any emotion, and where
mhm,
you're penalized or disciplined for having emotional releases or
yeah,
outbursts?
yeah,
The other thing I want to mention about the Citadel that I found really interesting is, there is so much pageantry.
mm,
We're seeing this again in right-wing media with more crusader imagery,
sure.
and imagery, of course, of guns, of weapons, and so much of it again is a posture. It's fake. Most of these politicians are not people who go hunting on a regular basis,
Yeah,
or people who work in law enforcement. But what I heard from this cadet who I was talking to at the Citadel is that yes, they do all these military maneuvers and they
yeah,
have weapons, but the reality is the weapons are dummy rifles.
yeah, sure.
Not, I mean, thank goodness.
Yeah,
But it just was a real metaphor for me of how much of this is pretend. And then you have the tragedy of young white boys and men who don't realize it's pretend and they
yeah,
begin to think it's real. And those are the ones who veer off often in violence towards others or towards
yeah.
themselves.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And of course, reading your book, I'm the father of two sons and two grandsons. Is out of my five grandchildren, two are boys. And one of them, my son, who joined the Marine Corps right after high school, went off and fought twice in Afghanistan and once in Iraq during the beginning of those wars. And what was interesting to me is when he came back, having been gone into the Marines out of high school and then serving 5 years because they asked him to do an extra year because we were in war, and he volunteered to do that.
Mm,
Then he went to the University of Chicago,
mm,
which is a very high end sort of liberal school. And
mhm,
he called me one time, sort of with amusement, saying, "Well, Dad." And he was, of course, older than the other people there because he had done 5 years in the Corps. So he went in his 20s, mid 20s. Um, but they were doing a kind of a DEI type program of racial integration and explaining to kids, you may be from a white background and this and that and the other, and you've probably never been this close to such a racially diverse group, et cetera, et cetera.
mm,
And it made him laugh
mm,
because, of course, he had been in combat with Riaz, who was his best friend out of boot camp, who learned English in boot camp from their black drill instructor
mm,
and spoke what John called boot camp English.
mm,
But the interesting thing for John, and this story has a point, is when he came back, his actual experience in the arena of warfare, of being killed and killing and risking your life, was two things. One, an absolute brotherhood with other males of other races.
Yeah.
And so he smiled because he said, the person doesn't know it, but one of the people she's talking to has been showering with, living with, sleeping next to for warmth in the Hindu Kush, Black and Hispanic Americans of all backgrounds who had my back and I had theirs. The one thing I didn't need coming to the University of Chicago was a lesson on how to get on with other people. So he came out with a very, if you want to put it, this diversity and inclusion mindset from warfare,
Yeah.
which is not what you hear in the manhood thing, bullshit thing out there. And secondly, he came out with an abiding hatred of firearms and basically I remember him looking at it as a sticker from the National Rifle Association and said, "Oh, look at those assholes! They imitate the Marine sticker. You'd think from a distance they're
Yeah.
Marines."
They do.
And he said, the difference between the way we use firearms is at boot camp they were locked up in an armory. You couldn't touch them, and you would be severely punished for mishandling a firearm. These are serious things, and the idea of AR-15s just floating around in the hands of these idiots shocked him as a former Marine. So the funny thing is sometimes the male image that is sold by these grifters,
Yeah.
like Elon Musk and all these
Yeah.
others, are all these cage fighting idiots, and that sort of this is the idea of manhood. John sent me. I didn't get any pictures from him there, but somebody took a picture who was with John of him and another Marine standing outside a girls' school in Kandahar guarding it because it had been under attack by the Taliban. And that image of what he was actually doing, as opposed to this sort of weird, crazy, wacky, shitty idea of manhood, is so distinct to me. And he lives in my neighborhood, and I'm helping raise his three kids. And watching him as a father and his relationship with his wife doing a genuinely testosterone rich manly thing had the exact opposite effect on him. It made him a much gentler, kinder
Yeah.
person. I know I've gone on at length about that, but it just meant so much to me to see that that was his reaction to warfare and carnage, was to actually go the other way and to believe more in the brotherhood of all races and to be more open to children and all the rest of this through his experience of doing combat with a genuinely oppressive group of people, which was the Taliban. And so, I just want to conclude by saying what an irony that the theology of the white nationalist Christians is an exact mirror image of the Taliban's view of women that my son risked his life to try to stand against. Futilely, it turns out in the end. And,
Yeah.
I've got a picture hanging on my staircase of him guarding a girls' school because he believes in girls having an education.
Amen.
Yeah, little sermon in the middle of our interview.
No, I love that you share that story because I can think of a lot of parallels, not only with folks who've served in the military and myself coming from a family. My grandpa was a Marine. He served in World War II. My great grandfather was in World War I.
Yeah,
Father-in-law was in Vietnam. And it is often the case that those who have, and I think about my experience too as a sports writer and being with men who have been, in
right.
the NFL locker rooms, in the Super Bowl, in the
Sure.
NHL. It's not the case for everybody. I mean,
No.
Harrison Butker, he's an exception, but he's also, he is a
Yeah.
kicker.
Yeah.
Um, but there are so many cases of men that really have been in high masculine,
Yeah.
stereotypically situations. And it does lead them to a much more authentic version of relationships. And it also, I think, speaks to the sense that it sounds like for your son and for the men I've known who draw these conclusions, they're really rooted in their own identity and their own
Yeah.
faith.
Yeah.
And they don't have to put on
Not at
this
all.
sort of veneer
No.
because it's real. Their commitment to strength, their commitment to care for others is real.
Yeah.
So I hope your son writes a book someday about where he came from and his positions because I think that that witness is sorely needed
Yeah.
to counter these other claims.
Yeah, and when someone like my son, and people like that too, it gives such a false ring of
Yes,
lying to
yes,
this faux, fake masculinity, virtue signaling, whatever. Because starting with my son and the other Marines I knew through him, this is just not who they were. And they didn't. That's not the conclusion they drew. It was the exact opposite. He was so relieved to come back and and be in an environment that wasn't about that stuff, that the last thing he ever wanted to do was pick up another gun or whatever. I mean, it's just not. Anyway, so let me dive back into the book. Let's talk about Driscoll a minute.
Yeah.
One of Piper's most prolific acolytes and adherents, who got his start partially by blogging on Piper's Desiring God's site, was Seattle pastor Mark Driscoll, who you mentioned earlier, who I'll tell my listeners again was a very big deal at a certain point, who would popularize a masculine Christianity specifically aimed at, excuse me, young white Christian men. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that and talk about his impact, because it was a baleful impact. And his story ends, as so many evangelical leader, mega pastor, whatever bullshit stories end, with disaster because he gets caught doing something terrible, and etc. But that's not the point. His teaching had a huge influence, and it's still, he was the sort of the evangelical Andrew Tate, if you want to put it that way, putting it in. So do two things: talk about Driscoll and his significance and what he did to us, and how that reverberates into the Trump era, but also talk about, let's get into the actual theology, the lying, stupid theology that basically cuts out 9/10 of the New Testament and takes 4 verses out of context to try to make Jesus into this, cage fighter.
Yeah, where to start? Well, and the sad thing is too, as we know is so often the case, unfortunately, in conservative evangelical stories, you have these men who have so much power and influence and wealth and really grift because of their narcissism. And what happens is, even when they do have a fall from grace, they rebound. They come back. And so you see in the book that even though Mark Driscoll lost his congregation in Seattle, he now is pastoring in Scottsdale, Arizona, continuing to write books, continuing to be all over social media, continuing to take money from people, manipulate people. Uh, so that's the unfortunate part. And that's definitely a must-read section of the book, I will say, is when I went to Scottsdale to his new congregation, and just the visceral sense of lying and of evil that I encountered being in that place. And also seeing this man on stage, as we're talking about, who, he's not a tall man, he's not a particularly muscular man, and he's just trying so hard to appear like he's something that he's not, by denigrating others and by hurting others.
The recycling of Christian evangelical right-wing leaders who,
Yes.
sleep with their secretary or molest somebody or whatever. I mean, this just goes on and on and on and on. And as we know that, because obviously the grift has to continue. It's your shtick. So how does a person like that keep finding a new congregation to succor? I mean, just step out of your book for a minute and talk about that, because it's always boggles me. It's the same kind of question people ask you when they say, well, how did evangelicals vote
Yeah.
for this thrice divorced alleged rapist Donald Trump twice? How can that be? Well, another how can it be question. And I always put it together a little bit. And I've said this to people. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I say, well, they've been well trained from their mother's knee, because these are the same people that keep putting people like Driscoll back in power again. They're suckers for being conned.
Yeah, and I think it's a tale as old as time, from a theological lens. And when you ask me to dive into that too, I mean, there's interpretations of really from the beginning of creation that
Yeah,
zero in on the story of Adam and Eve, and immediately put onto that story a gender hierarchical view, that puts Adam above Eve, that casts Eve as the deceiver, Eve as forever cursed, and
yeah,
use that gender hierarchy as a lens by which to interpret the entire Bible. But I think what I continue to be met with, unfortunately, and we see this in the publishing industry too, certainly, and in journalism, we see it everywhere right now.
yeah,
It's worse than it has been, I think, at any point in my life, is that narcissism is so attractive to
yeah,
people.
yeah,
And narcissists really develop a following, and people go into this other place. When people ask me those questions about how did Christians follow Trump, how did they continue to be in the midst of it,
yeah,
really emphasize this is not a rational argument that people are acceding to.
right.
for the most part. We have to distinguish between those who are doing it because they think they can make money. But for people who really buy in, it's, and I'm sure that those who are watching this and listening can relate to this when they're talking to their loved ones who are really caught up in this. It's almost like a switch flips in
Sure.
someone's head. And all of a sudden, you're no longer talking to your loved one, but you're talking to someone who is parroting lines that they've heard on Fox News, on right-wing media,
Yeah.
and it's just this self-perpetuating cycle. And right now, we have that natural human tendency to follow narcissists, to feed into them, to derive your own identity from a narcissist's identity.
Yeah.
Um, we have that perpetuating cycle that's being fed by the algorithm
Yeah.
and being fed by billionaires who are narcissists themselves,
They are.
who
Yes.
are also trying to project this sense of strong male identity when reality they're not like that.
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg, sadly, my fellow millennial, Jeff Bezos, of course, Elon Musk, all people who have a lot of influence on social media platforms, which have become the main purveyors of
Yeah.
information for people today. And they are perpetuating that same feedback loop where the algorithm prioritizes content that is narcissistic in nature, that is trying to emphasize this same attraction to power and money and wealth. And nuanced, loving conversations just get lost in all the screaming.
Yeah. And and linking that narcissistic thread into the Christian leadership, of course,
Yes.
is the point. But also it explains why the algorithms are written this way. It's not by chance. These guys are not conning people who are unlike themselves. It's basically a societal wide illness that they have cashed in on in the same way that someone like Driscoll cashes in on the needs and longings of young men to be whatever.
Yeah. And I think, again, to look at it from a journalism lens, a lot of leading media reporters or pundits, they're just entirely uneducated and unacquainted with this conservative Christian world
Yeah.
that has shaped so much of America. And so they look at it, and I would say this of a lot of leading Democrat politicians as well. They have no idea what's going on. They don't get
Yeah.
it. But the groundwork for all of this has been laid for many, many years through
Yeah.
a totally alternative media atmosphere, whether it's
Yeah.
movies, music, books, schools.
Sure.
All of this has served as methods of indoctrination in order to create a compliant public, and so that we see this authoritarian structure intensify in American government. And it is
Yeah.
inseparable from religious patterns and from American Christian history.
Yeah. And let me just go to something in your book that is kind of where you offer the alternative.
Yeah.
Excuse me if I cough a little here, but I want to read this. What we can know, though, is that by, excuse me, offering young boys and men a window into a non-militant, peaceful, loving, caring, friendly, hopeful, vulnerable, needy, well-adjusted, occasionally tearful Jesus, we can offer young white Christian boys and men a much fuller, healthier, and more accessible vision of masculinity, one that's more reflective of the wide spectrum of masculinity and femininity occupied by both boys and girls. So in your book, while avoiding going to 5 points of things you can do at the end and rather say, I've told the stories, you do offer a defense of a completely alternative vision of what it is to be male, period. Whether, you're male, gay, male, straight, doesn't matter, but what a male can be, and a vision for your own sons, shared by, say, my vision for my son. So talk a little bit about just the theological difference between the one vision and the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of that Sunday school answer where the answer is Jesus kind of holds here. Because we do have, if we want to look towards an exemplar of what a different kind of masculinity looks like, we do have a really powerful example in the male man Jesus, who walked this earth, who lived, and who gives us a really different vision of relationality, of friendship, of his treatment and honoring of women. And I think that that's a really powerful example to point to. And that's why
Yeah.
it gets really tough because American Christianity has purported so much of the opposite, so
Yeah.
that people at this point are like, we got to throw it all out. We got to
Yeah.
get rid of all of it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the antidote has within it the same, it comes from the same origin
The
as
same
some of
source, yeah.
the
But
negative.
one of the things that I don't, you get into the book is this idea of manhood, and you talk about here. Let's just see this passage. One of the biggest problems involving men and boys in America is the ways in which social media influencers and advocates of intense masculinity have made their way into positions of political power. Well, again, it's unfortunately prophetic, but um, what I wanted to sort of bring up in that context is something that I find a lot of people on the left and on the liberal side of things are uncomfortably honestly discussing. I'm not saying you will be, but I'm going to throw it out there and I want your reaction to this. As a 72-year-old white male who came out of the evangelical movement, and I'm doing a book soon on the biography of Dr. C. Everett Koop by someone called Nigel Cameron. We're going to be interviewing. I've got an advanced copy here that he interviewed me at length for because I worked with C. Everett Koop on our anti-abortion series in the 70s. So my history goes way, way back in this, and he's got a whole chapter on my dad and my involvement with Koop as part of his history. But as someone who lived through the beginnings of that movement and then watched the trajectory of how the pushback came, it's my observation that while the right wing has become expert at viciously trolling liberals and the left itself was incredibly naive in the way it thought it could troll the right and not have anything happen. And I would say the election of Donald Trump is the effect of 50 years of stupidity on the left in terms of making peripheral issues central and then going further always and trolling them. And I'll just give you one example that I admit is totally up for discussion, but it's a kind of a what if thing. When Roe v. Wade came down, Rockefeller, who was a Republican, and Reagan, who was a Republican, had both legalized abortions in their states. And then Reagan changed his mind to get evangelical votes after my dad and I and Dr. Koop helped create the evangelical wing of the pro-life movement. But when you looked at the way Roe v. Wade was written by black men, there have been liberal commentators and justices who have commented on the fact that it was so unnecessarily broadly written in, say, comparison to the way the French legalized abortion with, in the same context, and limited it. And that was simply one more instance of the fact of, what I'll call the sort of drag story hour syndrome, the absolute unnecessary aggravation of the right, almost as if there was a sort of an in-your-faceness about it. And I think the same thing about pronouns. I think the use of language. I think that you always look at this and it's always the margin that suddenly goes this bridge too far. And that's a 50-year history. So I want to talk to you as someone who had people in your family who were pro-Trump and who lives in the midst of a pastorate. How on earth do we how do you put the broken egg back together again without, first of all, saying, what exactly is it that the left and liberals and the Democrats are offering to a group of very angry people? Some of their anger being justified in the sense that they are looked down on. They have been branded by the elite. They have been kept out of those positions. And now they've gone to a position where they're advocating for and watching the wholesale destruction of our entire system, including changing sides and suddenly being on the side of Vladimir Putin because he's anti-gay like they are, or whatever it may be. Things that, as a 72-year-old man, I never could have pictured the right wing suddenly being on the side of Russia in a land war in Europe, stuff that neither of us could have ever imagined happening. And I don't think we can unpack this without beginning an honest discussion of the way the left has trolled the right unnecessarily, particularly in everything that came out of the sexual revolution. And it just seems to me when you get into people's sexual identity, you're getting into the same area as it would be for a black person to watch someone in blackface mocking them with a ukulele. It's a visceral reaction. And so I just think the mistakes the left made in the last 50 years was to embrace unequivocally, without any pushback whatsoever, certain aspects that turned out to just be horribly misogynistic. For instance, you think of Hugh Hefner and the whole thing with the Playboy Mansion of drugging women and passing them off to his celebrity friends. Talk about boys, first exposure to sexuality. One of the things I'm thankful for is that, my first kiss was enjoyed at age 12 or 13 before I had ever seen any online porn. My introduction to sexuality was not pornography. And as a result, when I met Jeannie when we were 17 and 18, we had a real relationship. And I got her pregnant when we were teenagers, so fat lot of good it did us, but we're together 55 years later. And one of the reasons why is we have a decent sexual relationship because both of our idea of sexuality was formed pre-online porn, etc. Long-winded thing, but I really want to ask you and take the time. You're a mother, you have two sons. At some point they're going to run into telephones if they haven't already and carry one in their pocket. What do we do with the fact that when it came to the sexual revolution and all ideas of sexual identity, the left just totally bought into the Kinsey idea of sexuality and never asked any questions? And I think it's because they were fundamentally anti-Christian. I think I am an atheist. I am anti-Christian in that sense. But I think it was an academic elite pushback that made it possible for all this to keep happening because they said, oh, well, this is an answer to the prudishness of Catholicism. This is an answer to stupid evangelicals. And they got in everybody's face with it. And they've never let up and they've never backed off on any of it. It's always, well, we're going to take another step. And I think that emotionally triggered more in what we call the right-wing Christian movement than anything else. That's my own theory.
Um, you give me a lot to work with here.
And you can say, "Hey, I'm full of shit," and disagree with every point and take me out. I'd like it if you would, because I'd like to be talked out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point you're talking about, maybe, I think maybe historically that might have been the reasons for some of this rhetoric. I will disagree with you that I think that there's been some sort of overreach, and I would have agreed with you years ago. I myself have shifted on this. But that there's been some sort of liberal overreach. I mean, I think if you look at the Democratic Party generally and its leadership, if anything, they've been incredibly timid. And
Yeah.
I think a bigger detriment to the Harris campaign
Mm,
than, talking about pronouns, I don't think that shifted the race.
mm,
I think a bigger detriment actually, and you'll probably disagree with me on this, was campaigning with Liz Cheney. I
hmm
think that it gave people the sense, and I think what drove this Trump election more than ideology, more than, religious conviction, uh, was instead a sense of nihilism
hmm
and a sense that this vote for Trump is just a middle finger to the world. And I think and I'm talking particularly, I think, here about younger voters who
hmm
we saw move in swing states in some significant ways toward the Republican Party and towards Trump. Uh,
hmm
and I think some of that was driven by, Biden's dishonesty about his own health. I
hmm
think some of that was driven by this sense, Trump excels when people are nihilistic.
Yeah.
Excels when people believe that there is no actual truth, all
hmm
politicians are corrupt.
Sure.
That feeds into Trumpism.
Yeah.
Um, and I think all the things that you're talking about are true to an extent, but I don't think they give Trump the election. I think this recent election was more driven by a sense of total nihilism, cynicism, And also, too, when we look at this right-wing shift, and I agree with you, so many of the previously held tenets of conservatism have been totally flipped upside down
Yeah,
in Trump, in this administration. What links Trump to Putin is authoritarianism. And so
yeah,
all of our previous conceptions about Russia, about communism, about anti-communism, all of that is kind of in the dustbin of history at this
yeah,
point because now Putin and Trump and Orban and China, they're linked by personality, by naked power, much more than they are by ideology. So that guys like Driscoll can stand there in Scottsdale, Arizona and
yeah,
make comments about Karl Marx when Karl Marx's ideology, as you know, has
yeah.
very little to do with anything that's happening in China or Russia today.
Yeah, and I would say I don't disagree with what you're saying. So I threw out what I was saying to see what you would say back. Um, but I think that where what I'm saying is true is not related so much to why Trump was reelected, but the playbook he was given in Project 2025. I know those guys, and they have spent 50 years, the key leaders there,
Yeah.
putting together the playbook that would push back on what I was talking about, which is where Amy Coney Barrett comes from, too, out of a very, very tight little
Yes.
weird religious group.
Yes.
So I think that it's not just a question of the election. I think it's a question of the Project 2025 playbook. And that playbook is being
Right.
written by people who basically were formed in the Frank Schaeffer era in the 70s, and who basically have been pushing back against Roe v. Wade. And I use that simply as a symbol of everything. You could talk about trans rights or gay marriage, Roe v. Wade. This is all one thing to them. And essentially, one of the most interesting interviews I did on this podcast a few months ago was with a woman who had written a book with someone who's now in hiding from Vladimir Putin. And she's an academic in Rome, Italy,
Mm.
on the correlation between the evangelical leadership on culture war issues and how they actually worked to make those same issues part of the Russian Orthodox program when it hadn't been before. And we're meeting with people like Kirill and the Archbishop of Moscow, who's all in Putin's corner now, and how they basically coached Putin's people that if he would take up this culture war mantle, which was made in America, and say, he's defending that he could get people on his side. And he did. That's how he won over Tucker Carlson. That's how he got these recent converts to a very hardline Roman Catholicism. So you may be right when it comes to the weeds of why Trump got reelected. But I think in terms of the right wing program that taps
Yeah.
into a visceral fury, they are Project 2025 is basically the pushback that starts with the 60s and the sexual revolution
Yeah.
into abortion, feminism, women's rights, and now the reason they had that 900-page book ready is because these old white guys, some of whom are in Opus Dei and other Catholic organizations, they've been thinking about this for a long time, and I know some of them personally,
Yeah.
and that's where they come from. So what's your reaction to that?
Yeah. I agree with you. And I think that was the tragedy of the Democrats fumbling of the presidential election because
Yeah.
you now have an American electorate that I don't think a majority of those who voted for Trump necessarily wanted Project 2025.
No,
But
of course
Project
not.
2025 is going to be the law of the administration. That is
Yeah.
what, as you're talking about, the people who are in power now,
Yeah.
a lot of them are ideological. I think JD
Yeah.
Vance is pretty ideological when it comes to this stuff. Trump's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
But so that's what happens, right? In authoritarian countries is you have a minority that
Yes.
seizes power
Yeah.
even when the vast majority of the country initially was not on board with their ideas,
Yeah.
but nonetheless begins to institute severe social penalties. And I do think it's scary, as a German American Lutheran, as I look back to 1930s Germany and the way
Yeah.
that they do test runs of
Yeah.
how
Absolutely.
much
How
discrimination.
far can we get?
Yes. And
Yeah.
so we're going to start with deporting what we're calling criminals, who are from a Venezuelan gang.
Yeah.
And it's fine because they're criminals. So it's not going to affect you good white people.
Yeah.
Or we're going to start by demonizing trans people and we're going to say, well, if Democrats just wouldn't have talked about transgender issues,
Then
this
it would
would
be
all be
okay. Yeah.
safe.
Yeah.
And that's where I disagree with it. I don't disagree with your sense of this sort of academic elitist, sort of patronizing view of Americans that
Yeah.
some leadership of the Democratic Party has certainly had. I
Yeah.
agree with that. But I do think that it's sort of a red herring to distract from what's really going on. And it ultimately that this is about power.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. But I also think that the left underestimates where they live,
Mm,
and they've been too insular.
mm.
I always
Yeah.
use this example, and
Oh,
it
yeah.
sounds self-serving, but it's one that I lived through. When my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, sold 1 million copies and was the best-selling book in America by any stretch when it came out, it wasn't reviewed by anybody like the New York Times or the Washington Post because they didn't pay attention to people like that.
Right.
But basically, that was the blueprint for everything that's followed. That is where the guys who were evangelical backgrounds and Roman Catholics too formed their thinking to create Project 2025. And the media did not pay attention because all their people went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, and they didn't know anybody like this. And so why would you pay attention to this unwashed mob of evangelicals in the heartland, all reading a radical manifesto calling for the overthrow of the US government by some means, unless they did, changed and became Christian again?
And now why that's changed, I think, is that you have a right-wing elite that also came from the Ivy League, which is
Yes, that's right.
interesting.
Yeah, I want to jump back into one thing from your book here. Adrift and aloof from the would-be closeness of nuclear family, teenage Caleb was still desperate for acceptance and belonging. He found it amidst a group of white supremacist neo-Nazi skinheads who roamed the streets of Phoenix in the late 90s. And you talk, we sort of mentioned that story before, but I just want you to let's go back to your book here and make that one of the stories you tell and how that all played out.
Yeah, I was hesitant to write another book on right-wing Christianity after Red State Christians. And it really was Caleb's story that drew me to this topic really powerfully because I think it's such a story that people can relate to. And he was seeking belonging and community. And the reason he was seeking it at first among skinheads was because he didn't find it to be authentic in the Christian community and churches that his family was attending.
Yeah. And then,
And then he's with the skinheads and he's watching the violence and the intensity and I think what's really instructive for people to notice is that following Mark Driscoll was comfortable for someone who had just come out of a skinhead group, that
yeah,
there were enough parallels there
yeah,
to white
exactly.
supremacy that he felt comfortable that it served as a transitional place for him.
Yeah. And when you look back at the book and you go fast forward to your conclusion here, where you say, um, I believe it is only the stories that save us, only stories can make us reach for a common humanity far beyond insecure, desperate, greedy, grasping hands of a fake white Jesus. And so instead of telling you 10 ways to stop worrying about young men in your life, or 10 ways to prevent another school shooting, a task that our legislators really ought to be taking on. I told you about John and Ryan and Travis and Eric and so forth, and you go into that. And I just want to go there to once again give people a flavor of this book, because as I warned my listener early, obviously I'm going to be going to the issue oriented side of your book. Rather than trying to retell each story. But the book itself, proportionally, is far richer in stories than it is in the kind of material I've drawn out. So I can bait you into giving me answers and rebuttals and making it an interesting conversation. So I want to end by doing a couple things. First, just quickly reintroduce you. This is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And I am with Angela, who is an author, and we've spoken previously about red state Christians and a journey into white Christian nationalism. How did that book do in terms of people's response and reaction to it before we wrap this up?
Yeah, well, and we talked about it recently, but it actually first came out in 2019.
Yeah, I remember that. It was a long time ago, but it was
Yes.
so prophetic and crazily on it was like, are you going to write a new introduction to it?
Yes, and did get to do a new version in 2022 and add content from George Floyd, from COVID,
Right.
and from January 6th. Um, So that book does continue. It's got what they call in publishing a long tail and
Yes,
continues to sell. And since I was last on, they've made an audiobook version. So if
good.
you have people who haven't read it yet, who are people who prefer audiobooks or need
Did you read
audiobooks for
it?
whatever reason, it's out
Did
there.
you
What's that?
did you read the audio version?
No, I didn't. Last time I was on your show, somebody said I shouldn't read the audiobook because they didn't like my voice.
Well, basically they can just unsubscribe. We're done with them. I like your voice.
But I had a good narrator, and there's an audiobook for the new one too. So
Are you going to do that one?
nope, we've got a narrator as
Who's
well.
publishing your books, by the way? Who's your publisher?
Yeah, it's Broadleaf, which is the ELCA affiliated, but Broadleaf Books has done a lot of great Christian nationalism books
Yeah,
from people like Brett
yeah.
Onishi, Amanda Tyler. So I'm proud to still be with the Lutherans there.
We have interviewed some of those authors. So we're discussing today Disciples of White Jesus and the Radicalization of American Boyhood, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe to YouTube where you're watching this, or on Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com, where I make commentaries that have, weirdly wide participation with people. So let me just go to something, to do with your book and just our whole overall discussion. What do you see next for this white supremacist, angry, tough, muscle-bound Jesus future in this news item you keep seeing that I've been reading about, and I'm sure you're aware of, where it says, a certain number of younger men are starting to go to church again and younger women are not. So that are they coming back because of that, or is that attractive to that group of people, or are they simply very spiritually empty and hungry because in the end you have to have something more in your life than Andrew Tate? I'm not feeding you lines. I literally want to know what you know about this movement, why you think it's happening, how this all plays out, and then just finally how the kind of prophetic voice of your two books, plays out. Where the hell are we going to be a year from now?
Yeah, and there's some great data on this from both Pew and from PRRI about looking at specifically, okay, what's really happening with young men and their religiosity. I would love it if it were like, yeah, young men are really coming back to church out of the spiritual hunger, because I do think there's a deep spiritual hunger in America right now, and
Yeah,
congregations and faith leaders need to be able and have the language and conversation to know how to address that hunger. Um, but what the data is showing us is that data around young men coming back to church, in particular, they're seeking out church bodies that are increasingly hierarchical. So they're seeking out very traditionalist Catholic churches. In some cases, they're looking at the Greek Orthodox Church. They're looking for Anglican type churches. They're looking for churches that are going to affirm this gender hierarchy, traditionalist family structure
yeah,
that that this kind of theology has been promoting. And
yeah,
I talked with a Baptist pastor the other day that was telling me even some of the pastors that she knows who have really bought into this ideology, men, Southern Baptist pastors, they're leaving the SBC in favor of Anglican churches, traditionalist Catholic churches,
yeah,
because the SBC, even though it's extremely conservative, was not hierarchical enough for them. So it's
yeah.
the hierarchy that's drawing them. It's not, unfortunately, a spiritual hunger, I don't think.
And where do they fit in with the incels? I mean, are these
Mm.
guys who don't have relationships and can't date, are they part of this new generation that doesn't even want to have sex anymore? I mean, how do you see it? Because it's all sort of a closed book to me and so different than, my background, whether you look at the Christian background or just the 1960s that I come out of. Either way, I'm on a different planet now.
Yeah, it's online. It's certainly part of the conversation, and I think it's why you see this common affinity for someone like Elon Musk, who's really more like from the tech bro sort of masculinity movement, and that movement does have a lot of commonalities with sort of incels. It's men who, a lot of them are software engineers, a lot of them are working in technology fields, a lot of them would be characterized as sort of maybe nerdy. They don't see
Yeah,
themselves as attractive to women. Um, their their contempt for women they're finding common cause with conservative Christianity.
Yeah,
And that's why I think you see in this Trump 2 administration a new alignment that matches better with disciples of white Jesus than it did with more of this traditionalist that
right.
you know so well, SBC, red state Christian patriotism Christianity that existed sort of with Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. Yeah, so the last bit that I asked you, and this is the dangerous one. So how do you see this playing out? Because basically, if your whole viewpoint is that you're angry with women and are going to put them down, and we have a demographic birth dearth, it doesn't seem to me that women are lining up to mate with these specimens and have babies. I mean, who wants these people as the father of your children? So how do, the North Korean version of this and the South Korean version of this is the one place where both of those countries are the same, and that is, they're basically falling so far below replacement level that there's the actual extinguishing of an entire population is a real possibility.
Yeah, and
And some
especially
of that has to do with their low view of women and the fact that men won't do shit.
well, and especially when you want to end immigration at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
So
it's
how's that play out?
well, and I think this speaks to a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. And again, I don't see it as a negative at all that progressives have wanted to support LGBTQ people and rights and marriage. What I think the mistake has been is that then it's left a vacuum where we haven't even talked really at all about what a flourishing heterosexual marriage looks like.
Yeah.
And so that's why you do see a lot of issues in heterosexual marriage because we haven't painted a picture of what it could look like on a healthy level. And so when people look for resources for flourishing in heterosexual relationships, what they're going to come upon is the gender hierarchy of conservative Christianity.
Yeah, but when this is actually put into practice, okay, you can speak from experience of people you know as both a pastor and as a woman, but also a wife and a mother. How does this kind of gender hierarchy actually work out? We've had a whole number of authors on who have written books, like Tia Leving's A
Yeah.
Well-Trained Wife about her
Yeah.
thing. You know about all these things. There's books coming out on this. Um, but it just seems to me that the what you might call the panda effect, that this type of male certitude is the guarantor of low birth rates and broken relationships because forget it's a male female thing. You can't treat other people this way and expect to have a flourishing environment for anything. You can't run a company this way. You can't have a family this way. If you're a teacher, you can't treat your students this way. How will this end for these guys? Because it's not going to work, in the very same way that Elon Musk has kids, but with six different women. None of those relationships worked and lasted. None of Donald Trump's relationships worked and lasted. How are these men models for any kind of a workable future for anybody? Forget Christianity, just on the basis of human relationships.
Yeah, you're stealing all the words right out of my mouth. I
Good.
agree. And I just think that this is the end game. And I was hoping maybe we would get here without having to have another Trump administration, but we are. And it just, as these movements intensify, they become increasingly cannibalistic
Yeah.
and they destroy everything in their midst, including people who are part of the movements. So I think we're going to continue to see that. And I do heartily recommend Tia Leving's work to look at, the actual, when they're trying to sell traditional marriage, trad wives and social media,
Yeah.
uh, what it really looks like in families and what it really looks like for children who are growing up in those settings.
Yeah.
The attacks on public school is going to put more and more kids into homeschool or unsafe private school situations.
Yeah.
So we got,
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to have to do another episode a few years down the
We
road.
will. All
Going
right.
on.
And write your next book. Okay. Disciples of White Jesus will be our It Has to Be Read May offering for 2025. And I really recommend this book. It's so beautifully written. Unfortunately, I haven't done it justice because we've been talking, I just want to say it one more time about the issues that the book brings up, because those are the talking points. But the book is a well-told myriad of stories which illustrate the point much better than just talking about them does. So well done. Thank you. And do me a favor. I'll be signing off here, but when I sign off, please you stay on board for a few minutes and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, and give him ideas on other people we ought to be talking to, because we get some of our best guests and run across people by recommendations, and or just whatever information you want to give him to how we can support your book.
Thanks. Thanks. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's always good to talk with you, and all the best with your family and everything, your crazy life.
That's right.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
All right.